I don't know about you, but my bad decisions don't normally put things into motion that can get a bunch of people killed. To be fair, I'm never really even in that type of position. But as the company starts their journey through Moria, there are some questionable decisions made, and one in particular that gives us a hint at future goings-on and puts the whole company in danger almost immediately. Hello everyone, welcome to Aude and Tulava, where we are walking our way through Tolkien's Legendarium. Today is part 2 of Book 2, Chapter 4, A Journey in the Dark. Don't forget to check the description for some of my favorite affordable cover versions if you'd like to help support the channel that way. And after a couple of requests, I have opened up memberships for the channel. There's currently only one tier, but there are plans, of course, to expand in the future. If you like what we're doing here, I'd love to see you in the membership area where you'll get early access to videos and members-only posts in the community section of the channel. It's a great way to support us here. With that said, let's dive in. The company has been blocked into Moria after escaping the Watcher in the water. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's important to note here that the trees have been uprooted, thrown in front of the gates along with some boulders. This leaves the door open, pun intended, for the reclamation of Moria after the War of the Ring. Of course, they could always tunnel out and build a new door, but it's often said the dwarves of the current age not quite have the skill the older dwarves had. It would be a shame for such a beautiful feat of engineering to be completely destroyed just because some silly monster with tentacles came calling. There's not much about dwarves returning to Moria except this little bit in the Peoples of Middle-earth, volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth. And the line of Dain prospered, and the wealth and renown of the kingship was renewed, until there arose again for the last time an heir of that house that bore the name of Durin. And he returned to Moria, and there was light again in the deep places, and the ringing of hammer and the harping of harps, until the world grew old and the dwarves failed, and the days of Durin's race were ended. This coincides a little bit with a genealogy in Appendix A, but there's basically nothing else about it. I think if Tolkien wasn't working so hard to get the Silmarillion ready for publishing, he would have dived deeper into this. But that's what we have, and I'm going to keep that as headcanon. At this point, the company has no other choice but to start the journey east in the dark of Moria. That and drink some more Mirror. The journey is dark and their only light is that of Gandalf's staff because, luckily, Glamdring and Sting are giving off no light as there are no orcs close enough. And as eager as Gimli was to enter Moria, he walked in the front alongside Gandalf. Gimli aided Gandalf very little, except by his stout courage. At least he was not, as were most of the others, troubled by the mere darkness itself. Often the wizard consulted him at points where the choice of way was doubtful, but it was always Gandalf who had the final word. The mines of Moria were vast and intricate, beyond the imagination of Gimli, Glow Sun, dwarf of the mountain race though he was. And there is a little theme I think we'll be seeing again later in the book. It's a theme of courage and faithfulness. It's friendship. Gimli didn't help Gandalf at all, really, except just being there and by his courage, his faithfulness to stay with Gandalf and provide comfort. This is something we're going to see when part of the Broken Fellowship enters the paths of the dead. It's Aragorn's strength of will, his courage, that brings the others along with him. And we'll see it with Sam and Frodo many times. Among the themes in the book, this is one I see or hear people reference probably the most. And this is just a really interesting kind of different look at it that I'd never really clicked to me before. And though Gandalf needed Gimli's courage to keep leading the company, the rest of the company needs some reassurance from Aragorn. "Do not be afraid," said Aragorn. There's a pause longer than usual, and Gandalf and Gimli were whispering together. The others were crowded behind, waiting anxiously. "Do not be afraid. I have been with him on many a journey, if never one so dark. And there are tales in Rivendell of greater deeds of his than any that I have seen. He will not go astray if there is any path to find. He has led us in here against our fears, but he will lead us out again at whatever cost to himself. He is sure of finding the way home in a blind night in the cats of Queen Beruthiel." Gandalf has been in Middle-earth for over 2,000 years at this point. Unfinished Tales tells us the Wizards, or Istari, arrived around year 1000 of the First Age, and it's January 3019. And I don't think Aragorn is just saying this to try and bring up, boost up everybody's spirits. He's not exactly a salesman putting up a positive spin on everything. Remember, Aragorn spent over 20 years in Rohan and Gondor fighting wars, and if he thinks Gandalf is awesome, he must be. Before The Hobbit, he stuck into the dungeons of Sauron in Dol Guldur by himself, and he met Thrain, which is partially how the quest of Aragorn began. Gandalf, that is. Not only is Aragorn supporting Gandalf to everyone and trying to keep them in good spirits, he's supporting Gandalf's decision. He's not vilifying him and his bad decisions to take them into this dark maze. He's supporting the entire decision And of course, he's making sure they all know he's even better than the cats of Queen Beruthiel. Which brings us to textual ruins. Some of you may know what textual ruins are. I learned the term listening to the Prancy Pony podcast. I like to think of textual ruins like I'm an archaeologist and I'm on a dig. I discover a little piece of pottery. I don't know what it is, but I know there must be more around. The Cats of Queen Beruthiel is a perfect textual ruin. It's a little tidbit hinting at a much larger story, which we don't know. If you're interested in her story, it's a note in Unfinished Tales at the end of this section about the Astari, note 7 specifically. Or Tolkien Gateway pretty much has the whole note in their entry on Beruthiel, which she's not exactly important except as a segue into the sidebar about textual ruins, which we just did. Tolkien uses them masterfully to pull you into the story. Of course, we now have this Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, History of Middle-earth, and quite a few other books and scholarly works that dive into some of these ruined stories. But when Lord of the Rings came out, almost everything was a textual ruin. Aragorn's story about Beren and Luthien, while Tolkien had written quite a bit of it, it's just a poem, single story. Faramir and his men looking to the west towards Numenor and Elvenhome. Bilbo's poem Errantry about Arendelle. All of these things hint at a massive story or stories lying just below the surface that we can't quite find. And this is one of the many things that makes his writing so amazing, and why we, all of us, keep coming back. Other authors have built up crazy backstories too. Robert Jordan in his Wheel of Time series. It's amazing. Read it if you don't mind 14 or so 800-page books. Brandon Sanderson too. They both developed textual ruins in their books. But Tolkien has the advantage of spending, 40 odd years or whatever doing it before getting published. Tolkien clearly is the godfather. Now, resetting from our little sidebar, we come back to the company and Tolkien remarks about the dangers of the journey. Here we have Frodo writing a little bit about the journey. Though he had been healed in Rivendell of the knife stroke, that grim wound had not been without effect. His senses were sharper and more aware of things that could not be seen. One sign of change that he soon had noticed was that he could see more in the dark than any of his companions, save perhaps Gandalf. Now, the reason I think this is Frodo writing this part is because he's making sure to describe how he's changing. This is really, I would say, probably the first big change for him. While we see more and more as the story goes on, this may be Frodo's first, personal realization of how this journey is changing him to where he'll never be the same again. As he writes the story, sitting in Bag End at the end of the War of the Rings, spoilers, he looks back and realizes this was when he realized what his journey was going to be. So anyone that says the story wraps up too easily and is, too simply like it's good versus evil, they haven't really read the book or thought about character development at all along the way. But something else I really just noticed as I was preparing this, Frodo could see better than anyone in the company except Gandalf. So it leads me to ask, what about Legolas? He's an elf. Don't they have awesome night vision? We all know the, what do your elf sides see memes. Legolas has great eyes. I think Frodo is talking more, let's say metaphysical here, especially since Legolas is the Sylvan elf. Frodo and Gandalf are the only two people in the company that have touched the light of the trees in some way. Gandalf, it's obvious, as we talked about a couple of videos ago, he's a Maya, but Frodo was definitely born after the trees were destroyed. But Sauron wasn't, and Frodo is carrying the ring, in which Sauron poured part of himself. So much, in fact, that Sauron can barely take a corporeal form now and doesn't even go out of his fortress. Frodo is essentially borrowing power from Sauron, but it clearly comes with a toll. And he was in any case the bearer of the ring. It hung upon its chain against his breast, and at whiles it seemed a heavy weight. He felt the certainty of evil ahead and of evil following. But he said nothing. He gripped tighter on the hilt of his sword and went on doggedly. It takes a toll on him for sure. He continually feels the evil. I obviously can't say I'm correct because we don't exactly have proof, but it feels right to me. What do you think about this? I'd love to hear your theories. My theory resonates with you, or just what your theory is if it's different. Now, we can expect every once in a while for Gandalf to be stymied. Anybody would be. I have no memory of this place at all, said Gandalf, standing uncertainly under the arch. He held up his staff in the hope of finding some marks or inscription that might help his choice. But nothing of the kind was to be seen. I'm too weary to decide, he said, shaking his head. And I expect that you are all as weary as I am, or wearier. We had better halt here for what is left of the night. Now, I think we all know this part of the story. Merry and Pippin start to rush in, only to have Gandalf hold them back and discover a giant hole in the floor. Aragorn and Gimli ask for caution, and we get that from most of the company. Except for Pippin. Pippin felt curiously attracted by the well. While the others were unrolling blankets and making beds against the walls of the chamber, As far as possible from the hole in the floor, he crept to the edge and peered over. A chill air seemed to strike his face, rising from invisible depths. Moved by a sudden impulse, he groped for a loose stone and let it drop. He felt his heart beat many times before there was any sound. Then far below, as if the stone had fallen into deep water in some cavernous place, there came a plunk. Very distant, but magnified and repeated in the hollow shaft. The first thing to remark on this is the fact that it was a deliberate act. The decision made by Pippin and not just an accident because of, let's say, curiosity about a skeleton. Why do I think this is important? Because it tells us about the characters. Pippin didn't accidentally kick a stone into the well. He didn't try to look at an old arrow stuck in a skeleton's chest. He was attracted to the well, pulled to it, you could say. And though it was like a sudden impulse, not a long thought out plan, he still made the decision to throw the stone in. One big thing this tells me about Pippin is he's young. We oftentimes forget to remember that Pippin is essentially a teenager in Hobbit years. I can't count how many people I've told to stop asking young children or even teenagers what they were thinking when they did something, because they weren't. My parents used to get so mad at me when they asked me, what do you think? What were you thinking? And I said, I don't know. But it was the truth. I wasn't thinking through the situation. The thought came into my head and I acted on it immediately. This was probably the worst decision any of the company made while in Moria. And there were some doozies. Just going into Moria in the first place, honestly, pretty high up on the list. But that's not the only thing we have to keep in mind as we read. Pippin was ruled by his sudden impulse. This happens a few more times in the books as we go on, as they're carried by orcs with the Palantir outside of Isengard and in Minas Tirith when speaking with Denethor. Of course, we're looking pretty far ahead, but I think it's really important to note this. Pippin's sudden impulses will all have pretty big, like massive consequences. Hopefully I'll remember to remark on them as we hit them again, but think about the tragedies he, let's say, thwarted with his sudden impulses. Is it just Pippin being Pippin, or is there something working behind the scenes there? Is it chance, if chance you call it? I mean, of course, we'll never really know. But that noise definitely woke something up in the deeps. We won't know yet, what yet, but we'll of course find out in the next chapter. And then of course there's more walking, almost a whole page of it. Again, this is where some people just get stuck. But they're just reading words. Tolkien is trying to bring the reader into the company's thoughts and feelings. He's trying to make you feel the close air, the darkness closing around you, the walls, the ceiling just getting closer and closer. He brings you down so that you can be brought up again. Gandalf seemed pleased. I chose the right way, he said, and at last we are coming to the habitable parts. And I guess that we are not far now from the eastern side, but we are high up, a good deal higher than the Dimmeril Gate, unless I'm mistaken. From the feeling of the air, we must be in a wide hall. I will now risk a little real light. He raised his staff, and for a brief instant there was a blaze like a flash of lightning. Great shadows sprang up and fled, and for a second they saw a vast roof far above their heads, upheld by many mighty pillars hewn of stone. Before them and on either side stretched a huge empty hall. Its black walls, polished and smoothed as glass, flashed and glittered. When everything gets too close, the walls, the ceiling, the air, they make it into a large chamber. A huge hall with glittering walls. It must have been amazing, to see that and feel that. Just stone around you for days, and finally glittering walls, a huge empty hall. It's a complete turn. And as they get to rest in the hall, we get another poem. The world was young, the mountains green. No stain yet on the moon was seen. No words were laid on stream or stone when Durin woke and walked alone. He named the nameless hills and dells. He drank from yet untasted wells. He stooped and looked in mirror and saw a crown of stars appear, as gems upon a silver thread above the shadow of his head. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away. The world was fair in Durin's day. A king he was on carven throne in many pillared halls of stone, with golden roof and silver floor and runes of power upon the door. The light of sun and star and moon in shining lamps of crystal hewn, undimmed by cloud or shade of night, there shone forever fair and bright. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote. Their forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mind the mason built. Their beryl, pearl, and opal pale, and metal wrought like fish's mail. Buckler and corselet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. Unwearied then were Durin's folk, beneath the mountains music woke. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang. The world is gray, the mountains old. The forge's fire is ashen cold. No harp is rung, no hammer falls. The darkness dwells in Durin's halls. The shadow lies upon his tomb in Moria in Khazad-dûm. But still the sunken stars appear, in dark and windless mirror. There lies his crown in waters deep, till Turin wakes again from sleep. So this poem is iambic tetrameter, which is we're calling Hobbit meter, except it was spoken by Gimli. I guess dwarves and hobbits have more in common than we initially thought. I love how Tolkien essentially puts couplets together with rhymes, and they just go together so well, even when the end of a line is in the middle of what would normally be a sentence. It's a story of life, discovery, success, and deep sadness. It kind of mirrors the whole story of Lord of the Rings. The more I learn how to read poetry, the more I love it. Please read the poems. Morning comes after Frodo and the company get a little visitor who turns out to be a big old jerk. But with the light, Gandalf decides he needs to explore a little bit so he can figure out where they are and which way to go. This is where they discover the room. It looks like a tomb, muttered Frodo, and bent forwards with a curious sense of foreboding. To look more closely, Gandalf came quickly to his side. On the slab, runes were deeply graven. These are Durin's runes, such as were used of old in Moria, said Gandalf. Here is written in the tongues of men and dwarves, Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria. He is dead then, said Frodo. I feared it was so. Gimli cast his hood over his face. This is a pretty sad way to end a chapter, but I want to cast our minds back to the Council of Elrond, where we talked about the rumblings among the dwarves in Erebor. This really just cements my theory that Sauron fomented discord among the dwarves in Erebor and planted the seed of Moria, or the idea of Moria, going back to Moria. According to Glóin, Balin took many of their folk, and since Smaug was no longer living in the Lonely Mountain, Sauron needed to get rid of some of the dwarves who could possibly resist him. Now there are many dwarves that will never contend with him. Balin and his group are dead. And on that note, we conclude A Journey in the Dark. Next week, we'll travel to the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember, we now have a channel and memberships open. But until next time, out into the they shall come again.